I'd like to welcome up our next storyteller. Kelly Buffalo Quinn has a story for us about a time when she lost her voice and found it again.
Hi, thank you, Megan. Thanks for having me. When I was 22, I became pregnant after a one-night fling, and I immediately knew I couldn't take care of this baby. The father had left for basic training by the time I found out I was pregnant, and he was weeks into his new life. I contemplated getting an abortion, but I eventually decided on adoption, and I'm very thankful I had that choice. I spent my first and second trimesters in relative solitude, largely ignoring my growing belly. I think it was kind of a way of a self-preservation. But by the third trimester, I knew I had to face this very real situation, and I began contacting adoption agencies. "What ethnicity are you?" asked a woman at one of the agencies, and I replied, "Native American." And then the line went silent. It was at that time, for the first time, that I learned of a law called the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. ICWA became a federal law in the 70s to preserve Native cultures and Native children that had been placed up for adoption. Before ICWA, there was a disproportionately high rate of Native children being removed from their homes, therefore being removed from their cultures. The woman said I would need permission from my tribal council to place my baby for adoption. So I called Meskwaki Family Services, which is my tribe's equivalent to DHS, and I told them about my plan. And they told me that as long as there were no objections to my adoption plan, that I was free to do what I felt I needed to do. With no objections that I knew about, I began looking for adoptive families. I read profiles of men and women who so desperately wanted to adopt a child. And I eventually found a family that I liked from Indiana. Mom, Tammy, owned a hair salon, and dad, Gary, was a competitive archer who had just recently competed in Olympic trials. They sounded perfect, young, active, involved in their community. So we began a relationship, and I would call them after every OB appointment. We were in regular contact. Sometimes they called me just to talk to him, and I didn't want to get attached to the life that was growing inside of me, but I gave him a name anyway. Braven Wyatt. Braven because I needed him to be brave on this journey, and Wyatt because I've always liked that name. It turns out Tammy and Gary also picked out a name, Wyatt Joseph, and we took this as our sign that it was meant to be. I spoke to Braven all of the time, and I let him know what was going to happen, who his mom and dad were, and I told him over and over that I loved him very much and I only wanted the best for him. On May 24th, 2005, I went into labor, and my mom took me to the hospital. I remember laying there watching the opening of the 5 o'clock news, and 3 minutes later, an 8-pound baby was placed in my arms. It was exhausting and painful, but I think I was just relieved it was over, or so I thought it was. Hours later, Meskwaki Family Services showed up to the hospital room, and I was informed that my dad had raised an objection to my adoption plan. He went to our tribal council, and I was then stripped of custody because ICWA had come into play. The decision to strip me of custody was made by my father and a council of 7 men. My voice as a woman and as an enrolled tribal member and as a mother was effectively silenced. My blood ran cold and I felt nauseous. All of the pain and soreness from childbirth was nothing compared to the feeling of my heart shredding into pieces as my hours-old baby was stolen by my tribe. Gary and Tammy were holding Braven as Meskwaki Family Services gave us this news, and I watched as their hopes crumbled. Gary went mute, and Tammy sobbed those sobs that are so hard, no sound comes out. My relationship with my dad ended that day, and I decided to keep my son so that he would not be awarded custody. And I began the very slow process of reversing the tribal council's decision. I became increasingly angry as the weeks went on, and in my head, all I wanted was a good life for my child, and I was acting in the best interest of my child. I had done nothing wrong, but yet I felt like I was being punished. I spoke to a reporter about my case, and as soon as the tribal baby battle story aired, the floodgates opened. I was contacted by reporters all over the world. Oprah called me. I was the topic of discussion on Tucker Carlson's podcast. But most importantly, I became a topic of discussion within my tribe. I was ostracized and called names like baby seller. I was told I was not a real Meskwaki. This is not how we do things here, they said. But once, as I was walking into the tribal center for yet another tribal court hearing, I was stopped by a guku. And guku means grandma in our language, the Meskwaki language. And in our culture, all of the tribe's elder women are your grandmas. She grabbed my arms and she said, "You tell them, Gwesh." And Gwesh means little girl in Meskwaki. "You tell them, Gwesh. Don't be afraid to speak up for yourself. You let them know. You are a strong Meskwaki woman." After a few months, I really realized I could not raise this child on my own, and I eventually gave in to my tribe, and Braven was placed with the Meskwaki family. After that, I began a period of self-loathing. I hated myself, hated my skin, where I came from, my heritage. I no longer wanted to be Meskwaki, and I gave serious thought to disenrolling myself from the tribe. I fell into a lot of bad habits. I stuck around Tama and wallowed in addiction, in jail cells, and in hospital psych wards until I ultimately decided to leave for good. And so I moved to Des Moines at the end of 2010. And when I moved here, I could disappear. Nobody knew who I was. Nobody looked like me. It was like I was a ghost. But as time went on, I began to feel like there was a piece of me missing. It became draining being the only native in my world. The fading into the background that I had loved before now just made me feel alone. In 2015, I learned of oil pipelines and the threat that they pose to Native communities. And I became involved in the No Dakota Access Pipeline protest. And I was so invested in what was going on in Standing Rock that I traveled there twice in the fall of 2016. The feeling of being around Native people from more than 400 tribes around the world, it filled me with warmth. One morning, as I was taking part in a water ceremony along the banks of the Cannonball River, everything just kind of hit me. Um, I was there listening to a prayer being said in another native language, and all I could think was, I wish I was home. And in that instant, my anger and my hate towards my community disappeared. It was like a switch flipped inside of me, like the final piece of a puzzle was snapped into place. I realized that the culture that I had been running from all this time was actually what I needed to feel whole. Sitting in that hospital room 14 years ago, well, now 15 years ago, I was obsessed with the thoughts of my choices, the good that I wanted to do for my son, the better life that I wanted him to have. But there you have it. I was only thinking of myself. ICWA forced me to think of the tribe, to consider the many instead of just one. Instead of my needs, I had to think of our greater heritage, our culture, and our identity. We are the originals, and it's laws like ICWA and decisions like my tribal councils that protect our bodies and our descendants, our language, and our way of life. The preservation of Indigenous cultures is paramount, and with time and perspective, that's become so clear to me. 3 summers ago, my great uncle passed away. He was also the tribal chairman of the Meskwaki Nation. And I knew I wanted to go home to be part of the ceremony to honor him. And I was very anxious, knowing that this was going to be the first time around my family in so long. But one by one, all of my gukus greeted me, and my guku Betty came up to me and gave me a hug, and she said, "Welcome home, Gwesh." And a pure calm just flowed over me. It felt right. Home is a funny thing, isn't it? It's a roof and 4 walls, but to me, it's a lot deeper than that. To me, it's a native way of life. I wanted to remove the native from my son by sending him to a non-native family. But the beautiful irony here is that he was placed with an upstanding traditional family on the Meskwaki settlement. So he's being raised with all of our customs, our language, everything. And he plays lacrosse, which is very native, and I love it. Gary and Tammy kept in touch with me for a little while afterwards. I think it was because we were all just scared to let go. One of their final correspondences with me was to tell me that they had adopted infant twins, one girl and one boy that they named Wyatt. Last year, I was able to spend time with my son for the first time since he was a baby. It was right around his birthday, so I took him birthday shopping. He had just turned 14, so he picked out a Call of Duty game and a Nike t-shirt, and he also picked out a couple of matching bracelets for us. But none of those things were as important to him as his desire to know me and my family. He wanted to see pictures. He asked so many questions, which I was happy to answer. He wanted to connect to the part of him that was missing. He wanted to find his missing puzzle piece, which is a feeling that I deeply understand. It took me years to come to terms with ICWA, but it preserved my Native child in the way that the law was meant to. And because of that, I know that he has a home, a true home among my people. Thank you.